I'd like to talk to you today about the battle for Malta. The fight for this small island was critical for the whole North Africa campaign in the Second World War. On Malta, the survival of the British Empire depended, particularly its Mediterranean interests. We start with one of Norman Wilkinson's fine paintings from his War at Sea collection, held in the National Maritime Museum. While the battle for the island began in June 1940, this talk will focus on the crucial years of 1941 and 42. This was to be a bitter fight that would be a close-run thing. Between the start of the war and the end of November 1942, when the siege of Malta was finally lifted, 35 supply convoys were sent in to support the island and its 250,000 population. I should point out that the Iron Navy is not an area I have researched heavily, normally just focusing on the sailing navy of the 18th century. I therefore cannot claim to be an expert. However, this talk was inspired by a family interest. My great-uncle, Ken Jellis, an 18-year-old merchant sailor, was on board one of the convoy ships, a liberty ship called the William Wirt, in the North African campaign in 1942. You see him sitting here on the afterdeck gun of his ship in Gibraltar. Sadly, Ken never saw the end of the war. He was drowned off the coast of Newfoundland in 1944 in the wreck of the SS Empire Knight. Further inspiration was gained through a recent research project I ran for our village archive group in Grendon Underwood. I looked into the ships on which 3 seamen named on our village war memorial served. One of them, Joseph Percy Hearn, served aboard the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle. It is to Ken and Percy that I dedicate this tale. We should start by considering the importance of Malta. The island sits in the middle of the Mediterranean, 1,145 nautical miles from Gibraltar and 1,006 nautical miles from Alexandria. These were the 2 principal naval bases for the Navy at the time. Malta's problem was that it was just 60 nautical miles from Sicily, and hence in easy range of enemy planes and fast naval units. However, if the island base could be sustained, it offered an excellent means of taking the fight to the enemy through the harassing of enemy convoys supplying the Axis army in North Africa. Without the island, the Mediterranean would have become closed to British shipping, essentially threatening the survival of Egypt and the Far East outposts of the Empire, themselves already under mounting pressure from the Japanese. The early phase of the war fell under the control of 2 key figures. Let us introduce the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean, Admiral Andrew Cunningham, based principally in Alexandria and known amongst the fleet as ABC. He is now considered the best admiral the Royal Navy had produced since Nelson. Cunningham was supported at the Admiralty by his friend, the First Sea Lord, Admiral Dudley Pound. Together, they devised the plans to ensure the island's survival and push through the daring and costly operations that we are to discuss. The first phase of the campaign to push through supplies to the island began in January 1941 and was known as Operation Excess. It ran 4 convoys through to the island, supported by Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville aboard his flagship HMS Malaya and the ships of Force H. The operation was not without problems, with the loss of the cruiser HMS Southampton being hit by a bomb directly into the engine room. However, we have the voyage cards of the 1 surviving merchant ships, the SS Essex, which reached Malta on the 6th of January. The second convoy on the 10th of January suffered further losses, with the damage to the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious on her return to Gibraltar being the most serious. However, the westbound convoy from Alexandria managed to deliver 2 freighters, the Breconshire and the Clan Macaulay, on the 10th of January. The push-through appears to have stirred up the Axis powers, as on the 16th of January the major air assault against the island began. It is important to remember that more bombs were to fall on the island over the next few months than had fallen on New London. Ju-88 and 87 dive bombers pummeled Valletta's dry dock facilities and airfields. Over 3,000 bombing raids were launched against the island, dropping 6,700 tons of bombs. A brief turnaround in British fortunes was to follow in late March, with Cunningham's masterstroke, the Battle of Matapan. Cunningham himself led the action on his flagship, the old Jutland veteran HMS Warspite. 3 Italian cruisers and 2 destroyers were lost, and the battleship Vittorio Veneto was seriously damaged, which essentially removed her threat for the rest of the war. However, the convoys of this action was to shield, known as Operation Luster, still only managed to get through 4 freighters. May 1941 saw Cunningham's next push that needed to get fuel as well as supplies through to the island. Operation Tiger saw 2 tankers and 4 freighters set out from Alexandria. The Royal Navy was to suffer great losses in pressing home of this convoy, with the loss of the destroyers HMS Kelly, Juno, Greyhound and Kashmir, together with the cruisers HMS Gloucester and Fiji. The Kelly, under the command of Lord Louis Mountbatten, was of course to act as the backdrop used for the Noel Coward and David Lean film, In Which We Serve. The 27th of May saw a further blow to British fortunes with the withdrawal from Crete. Admiral Rawlings led the withdrawal from on board his flagship HMS Orion, and against the operation was well executed. However, the damage to the aircraft carrier HMS Formidable and the loss of 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers led to a further blow to ABC's dwindling resources. Summer brought some further respite to Malta and to the Navy, with Germany's shift in focus towards the Russian campaign. Operation Substance saw 6 merchant ships run the gauntlet under the cover of battlecruiser HMS Renown, with the cruisers HMS Hermione and aircraft carrier Ark Royal. However, again, naval losses were sustained with serious damage to the cruiser HMS Manchester. The merchantman Sydney Star that you see here was one of the successful ships to arrive in Grand Harbour. Operation Halberd followed in September 1941, with 9 merchantmen, all capable of maintaining speeds of 15 knots. This included the Dunedin Star. HMS Rodney and Prince of Wales provided the lead cover, again with the support of Ark Royal. On the 8th of November 1941, Force K, led by HMS Aurora and Penelope, affectionately known as Pepperpot, led an audacious attack on the Axis Duisburg-Orbita convoy that was supporting Rommel's forces in Africa. 5 Axis freighters and 2 tankers were successfully sunk, including the Minatitlán. The next major blow to the Navy came on the 13th of November 1941, with the loss of HMS Ark Royal during a Spitfire delivery run from Malta, while close to Gibraltar, being torpedoed by U-81 under the command of Frederick Guggenberger. He was to be awarded the Knight's Cross by Hitler for his success. Guggenberger went on with his career and ended as a Contra-Admiral in the post-war German Navy, and actually became Deputy Chief of Staff at NATO. This loss was quickly followed by the loss of the Queen Elizabeth-class battleship HMS Barham. She was torpedoed by U-331 under the command of Hans-Dietrich von Tiesenhausen off the Egyptian coast, while operating with the 1st Battle Squadron and 15th Cruiser Squadron. She was hunting an Axis convoy. 3 hits in close succession resulted in a rapid list, and I'm sure most of you have seen the film footage taken from HMS Valiant of her subsequent explosion. 862 men died, including her captain. One of her lucky survivors was her Admiral, Vice Admiral Henry Pridham Whipple. These losses were to have a major impact on ABC's options. The next major push was to be the last effort of the year and became known as the First Battle of Sirte. The Navy could only field 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers under the command of Rear Admiral Philip Vian in HMS Naiad. These were to escort 4 merchantmen, including the SS Breconshire again, to supply Malta. Vian, facing 2 Italian battleships, executed an incredibly audacious and brave offensive manoeuvre, at the same time shielding the merchantmen behind a smokescreen. Once the Breconshire was safely past, Vian was able to withdraw. Sadly, the other 3 freighters were lost. The incessant aerial bombing of Malta continued, and in January 1942 the destroyer HMS Maori was sunk at her moorings in Grand Harbour. 21st and 22nd of March saw Admiral Vian repeat his audacious manoeuvring and shielding of the convoy in the Second Battle of Sirte. When HMS Naiad was hit, he shifted his flag to Cleopatra. For those of you familiar with the Navy training base HMS Raleigh, you will recall HMS Havoc. This poor destroyer took a direct hit from an 15-inch shell. Despite a flooded boiler room, she managed to limp to Malta. One of the merchantmen under escort, SS Pampas, was then sunk in the harbour. This was to be ABC's last role as Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean, as he moved to take on the role at Allied High Command with Eisenhower. His replacement was Henry Harwood, famous from his Battle of the River Plate exploits. His appointment was followed on the April 1942 by George VI taking the unusual step of awarding the whole island with the George Cross Medal in recognition of the island's determined bravery in standing up to the continued onslaught of enemy bombing. As the attack reached its zenith, on receipt of the award, Lieutenant General Sir William Dobbie replied on behalf of the island, "By God's help, Malta will not weaken, but will endure until victory is won." Brave words indeed. June 1942 was to be the next attempt to break through to the island, with Operation Harpoon bringing a convoy of 5 freighters and 1 tanker from Gibraltar, and Operation Vigorous taking a further 11 freighters from Alexandria. At the same time, the Eagle, under command of Admiral Edmund Rushbrook, was tasked with flying in Spitfires to support the island. Both Operation Harpoon and Vigorous were unlucky and failed in their objectives. Vigorous had to turn back due to a shortage of ammunition following incessant air attack, and to add to the gloom, HMS Hermione was lost. The only light was that Eagle successfully delivered her Spitfires, and just 1 merchantman got through. In all, Eagle successfully went on to deliver 172 Spitfires to Malta over 8 different trips between March and July 1942. The failure of Harpoon and Vigorous needed a return to the drawing board and a rethink on operational planning. The result of the hard work at the Admiralty was to become known as Convoy WS-21S, otherwise known as Operation Pedestal. The aim was to use high-speed freighters and a modern oil tanker. 14 merchantmen and the famous tanker Ohio, under the command of Captain Dudley Mason, were gathered at Gibraltar. To support them, the Navy drafted in a huge escort led by HMS Nelson, the flagship of Admiral Neville's Sefrit. She was joined by HMS Rodney and 4 aircraft carriers: HMS Victorious under Admiral Arthur Lister, HMS Indomitable under Dennis Boyd, and HMS Eagle and Furious. Her cruiser force, consisting of HMS Phoebe, Sirius and Charybdis, and 15 destroyers, was to be supported by Force X, commanded by Admiral Harold Burrow, in the cruiser Nigeria, supported by Manchester, Kenya and Cairo, and a further 11 destroyers. The fleet left Gibraltar on the 10th of August 1942. Eagle's fate was quickly sealed, as the very next day a U-boat broke through the destroyer screen. The young telegraphist aboard the ship appears to have suspected something was not right. Sadly, his concerns were not taken seriously. U-73, under the command of Helmut Rosenbaum, fired 4 torpedoes at Eagle. The old ship was hit and quickly listed to port. We have the account of a survivor from the ship's engine room, Lieutenant Derek Walling. He was serving as an engine room artificer. He writes, "I was checking electrical distribution boxes in the port wing engine room when we were torpedoed, and I consider my escape to be nothing short of miraculous. We were being tracked by enemy submarines, and the Eagle was the first ship to be torpedoed. She went down in just 8 minutes. I spent all 8 minutes trying to escape before the ship sank, and I was only 50 yards away when she turned over. After helping about 6 shipmates to reach the open hatch from which the ladder had fallen, by allowing them to climb onto my back, I was left trapped inside the ship. I could not see anything because it was pitch black, and I had to feel my way around in the smoke. I was close to giving up. It seemed impossible. Then I thought of my parents and prayed, 'Oh, God help me.' And in the last minute or two I found my way out of the engine room. Once on the high side, I knew the nearest place out of the ship was through the boiler room air intakes. As I got there, a stoker came up from the boiler room, mad with fear, and tried to get me to go back down into the ship. Somehow I got him to help me open the hatch. I pushed him up, and thankfully he helped me up too, but I still had to shove him over the side of the ship to safety, as he was still convinced he should go the other way. Without the stoker, I would not be here. We needed each other. I was covered in oil when I was scooped to safety aboard the destroyer La Forêt. Clearly a terrifying ordeal. Sadly, 130 souls rest in peace at the bottom of the sea. 67 officers and 862 crew were somehow picked up by the destroyers La Forêt, Venomous and Lookout. U-73 and her commander, Helmut Rosenbaum, had been notably successful. This boat was responsible for the loss of 8 merchant ships and 3 warships, including Eagle. The boat was fated upon her safe arrival back at port, and her commander received the Knight's Cross for the sinking. The next casualty was HMS Furious, receiving a torpedo hit in the bow. However, she managed to retreat back to Gibraltar. Indomitable was next, taking a bomb hit on the deck that killed 72 men. A day later, she was hit again with a bomb on the forward lift onto the flight deck. A further 44 men were killed and 59 wounded. She, like Furious before her, retreated back to Gibraltar. Despite Eagle's loss and the departure of 2 other aircraft carriers, the convoy continued. HMS Cairo was next to be hit, and she sank by the stern, with the same attack leading to a direct hit on the Ohio, resulting in a massive fire. The fire extinguished, the wounded tanker struggled on. She was next to suffer a direct hit when an out-of-control Stuka dive bomber hit her side and bounced off into the sea, causing another blaze of aviation fuel. The light cruiser Manchester had to be scuttled due to her damage, and the destroyer's Foresight was also lost. However, the cruisers Kenya and Nigeria, both virtual wrecks, lived to fight another day, with Admiral Burrow transferring his flag from Nigeria to destroyer HMS Ashanti for the remainder of the operation. In all, 9 merchant ships were lost, but once again the efforts of the Royal Navy were not in vain. The remaining convoys struggled on with 4 of the freighters, including the badly damaged Rochester Castle, Melbourne Star and the vital tanker Ohio, the final ship to arrive in Grand Harbour. All of the ships were damaged, but Ohio had been heavily bombed and was dead in the water. Her situation was so bad that she had to be strapped to 2 destroyers to keep her afloat and get her into the harbour. She would never sail again, but the unburnt remains of her 11,000-ton fuel cargo had arrived, along with 29,000 tons of cargo and supplies. After Pedestal, the scenario in the Mediterranean changed. Rommel's defeat at El Alamein and the drain of Axis resources in Russia meant that Malta had been saved. In September, with the arrival of the Santa Maria convoy, a public ceremony was held to recognise the islanders' bravery award from the King. By November, the siege of Malta was over. Overall, the Allies had lost 231 merchantmen in the Mediterranean, totalling 866,490 tons in 1941 and 42 alone. 76 warships and 48 submarines were sunk in the Mediterranean trying to protect them. The Italians lost 83 ships and 84 submarines, with Germany losing a further 68 submarines. The cost in lives and men cannot be understated, and all to ensure the survival of a tiny little plucky island. I leave you, as we begin, with Norman Wilkinson's fine painting of the battered Ohio approaching her final berth, and Grand Harbour's entrance, taken as I sailed into this magnificent haven. Thanks for listening.